We live in a very us and them time. This breaks into our lives in all kinds of ways. These days we divide based on where we are from. Maybe we're from around here in Northern Virginia, or maybe further south, from what I once heard someone call other Virginia. We divide based on who we vote for. The good party that one cable channel tells us is right about basically everything, or the evil one that another cable channel tells us is out to destroy America. We divide based on our generation, the greatest generation versus the boomers versus the millennials. Gen Xers, like myself, think everyone is crazy, and maybe we'd all be in a better place if we had just stayed on the couch in our parents' basements. We also divide based on the color of our skin and the part of the world our ancestors came from. We get into internet wars based on our preferred smartphone operating system. I've been told the world is even divided between those who prefer mayonnaise and those who like Miracle Whip. I like neither. You get the idea. Well, I suspect it won't surprise you, but this sort of tribalism, it's not anything new. In fact, it's a hardwired reaction in us as humans when we feel under threat in some way. We seem to simultaneously pull together and break apart in challenging times. Archbishop Bob Duncan, who I worked for before coming to Epiphany, had a little saying he repeated often, especially when people weren't being their best selves. It went like this: when we are under stress, we regress. When we are under stress, we regress. And man, do we ever regress? We humans can go from the pinnacle of creation, loving, intelligent, and empathetic beings stamped in the image of God, to something more like a panicked school of fish who, when attacked by dolphins, break into smaller schools, scatter in all directions, and run into each other. So where do we look? Where do we look for unity, real unity, in stressful times? Well, one option that we always seem to be interested in is congregating under the protection of powerful people we think can protect us in some way, people with political power, with cultural power, or maybe even spiritual power. In the time that Paul wrote the book of Romans, our New Testament reading this morning, that powerful person, that biggest fish in the pond, well, he was Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Empire. And people came from everywhere to be under his shadow, to be part of his school of fish, so to speak. Recently, I've been reading the Roman poet Martial. Yes, I'm a nerd. And he describes life in the city of Rome at almost exactly the same time that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And Martial actually writes about the way people flowed into that city from all over the world to be near to Caesar for the opening of the great Colosseum that's still standing today. And this is what he says. He says, "What race is so barbarous, Caesar, that a spectator is not in your city? Diverse sounds the speech of the peoples, yet it is one when you are acclaimed as your country's true father." Stressed? Cozy up to a big fish. Find a powerful person. Find Caesar and bow down. Now, another place to go for safety in stressful times is our family, our traditions, our heritage. We can look to the genealogy of our ancestors to give us meaning and purpose and hope in some ways. This is actually what the Jewish people tended to do at the time that Paul wrote the letter to the Roman church. In fact, you may remember Jesus' own Jewish followers leaning on their genealogy fairly heavily at times. In John 8, they say, "We are descendants of Abraham, and we've never been in bondage to anyone." They must have forgotten about Egypt, but that's another question. Or John 9, after Jesus had challenged that statement and their comfort in their genealogy, they say, we're disciples of Moses, but as for this man, Jesus, we don't know where he comes from. In other words, he's not part of the family. We don't need to listen to him. So it's a stressful time now. And it was a stressful time when Paul was writing the letter to the Roman church. Christians at this moment, they're starting to be noticed by the Roman world, and even by the big fish, by Caesar himself. And they are not being noticed in a good way. Christians in Rome are responding to that stress in the way that people do, by getting tribal, by dividing, by starting to run into each other a little bit. You see, the Jewish Christians in that church, and there are a lot of Jews in Rome at this time, they're leaning heavily on their tradition and on their genealogy. They are followers of Jesus, yes, but they are also descendants of Abraham and disciples of Moses. And they're not ready to give up that Jewish tribal identity. What about the Gentiles? The Romans and Greeks and people from all over the known world who, as Marshall says, flocked to Rome and to Caesar. They had, it is true, somewhere in its forums and streets, heard about Jesus, the Son of God, and they believed. At the same time, they're not ready to become Jews. They belong to different tribes. And not only that, but being a Jew already wasn't a great thing to be in Rome. Only a few years earlier, Caesar had kicked all the Jews out of Rome for causing trouble. They'd just been allowed back into the city. You see, the natural thing to do for the Roman church in this moment of stress and division, would have been to split up, for the Roman Christians to divide between Jews and Gentiles. The natural thing would be for human tribalism to kick in the church in this moment. But here's the thing we see so clearly in Paul's letter to the Roman church. Paul knows. He knows that following Jesus is actually supposed to do the opposite thing. It is supposed to bring all the people of the world together, both Jews and Gentiles, not keep them apart, siloed in their various tribes and nations. You see, in Romans chapter 4, and this is page 941 in the blue Bibles in front of you if you'd like to look it up, Romans chapter 4, Paul sets out to explain to this divided and stressed Christian church in Rome, both Gentiles and Jews, why they belong together as one instead of apart. And Paul explains this, explains why they belong together instead of apart. He does that in a really daring way. Speaking first to the members of the Christian Jewish tribe, he says essentially, I'll give you Abraham. I'll acknowledge our genealogy is important. Remember, Paul's a Jew himself. He says to them, yes, you're right. We are Abraham's descendants. And Abraham is the foundation of our way of knowing God. But here in Romans chapter 4, we see Paul begin by asking a loaded rhetorical question about that identity, starting right in verse 1. And the question is this: what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? In other words, what do we get from this relationship? What do we get from being descended from Abraham? And he goes on, he says, well, what does Scripture say? And then he quotes a little bit that we heard this morning from Genesis. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And the point Paul is making to his fellow Jews, it's very scriptural, it's very traditional, but it's also mind-blowing. You see, first Paul reminds them that Abraham didn't earn his salvation by keeping the Jewish law here in Romans chapter 4, because there's no law for Abraham to keep. The law came later with Moses. And not only that, but Paul reminds them that Abraham wasn't righteous he wasn't right with God because he was part of the right tribe. The Jewish sign of tribal belonging, circumcision, well, that also came later, Paul says, after God had already counted Abraham righteous, not before. He says this in verse 11, Abraham received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. Before he was part of the tribe, he was righteous. And all of this leads Paul to a powerful conclusion. Yes, he says, Abraham is the father of the Jewish tribe of Christian believers in Rome. And they're right to be proud of that. But then he says to them, get this, he's also the father of the Gentile believers in Rome as well. Roman Jewish Christians and Roman Gentile Christians, Paul says here in Romans 4, are both descendants of Abraham. And we see this so clearly starting in the second half of verse 11. Paul says the purpose was to make Abraham, the father of all who believe, without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. So he's talking about Gentile believers there. And then he goes on, and he says, and to make Abraham the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So there he's talking about the Jewish Christian believers. So do you see what Paul's done here in Romans 4? He's taken something that has been a cause of disunity and tribalism among the Christians in Rome, whether or not they were in the right tribe, whether or not they were descendants of Abraham. And he's made it into a foundation for deeper Christian unity. He's saying to Jewish Christians that Abraham's relationship with God, well, that flowed from God's initiative, not Abraham's tribal identity. God made Abraham righteous, not the Jewish law, not membership in God's tribe. And he's saying to Gentile Christians that Abraham and their Jewish brothers and sisters, well, they should matter to them because Abraham is the father of us all. As it is written, Paul says in verse 17, I've made you, Abraham, the father of many nations, many tribes. So how does Romans 4 apply to us here at Epiphany? These days, our tribalism doesn't tend to be about whether or not we are Jewish Roman Christians or Gentile Roman Christians. That's true. At the same time, it's a good thing for all of us to be reminded that we are part of Abraham's family, one family, based on faith, counted as righteousness only by God's grace. Paul says in verse 16, that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all of Abraham's offspring. And I also think that during these stressful and divided times we are in, it's good for us to be reminded that not only are all Christians part of the same family through Abraham, but that God's purpose is bigger than that. In the end, Abraham's faith and God's grace counted as righteousness through that faith. Well, that's actually meant to be the property of every single person, every tribe and nation, every tongue and people. Stressful times, they do make tribalists of us. And let's face it, we live in a stressful time. But God knows us as one people. Or if we're going to stick with images from the animal kingdom, one flock of sheep that may be scattered and divided at times, and in fact is, but is always meant to be together and under one shepherd. Romans 4 reminds us even further that God wishes to see all of us as children of the promise, all potentially justified and made right, made righteous in his sight, not through our own work or goodness, thank goodness, or through our genealogy, but through our faith in Jesus Christ. So do we see each other as God sees us? Do we see each other as fellow family members? Whether or not we are from a different place than them, maybe even other Virginia, whether or not we vote for the right political party, no matter which generation we were born in, and even, believe it or not, if we use Miracle Whip instead of mayonnaise. Or do we just see our tribes, our Caesars, our distinct and different family trees? I'll have to be honest and address something I've seen a bit more often lately, even here at Epiphany. It's this: our political conversations have become a bit more pointed than graceful at times. I wouldn't be surprised to learn I've fallen into this myself. Priests have political opinions too, believe it or not. And with the elections coming up, 'tis the season, I know, and our differences can be real and about important things that matter. But friends, this is a perfect time this year to remember that God does not see us as many tribes, as the red team and the blue team, as competing schools of fish trying to get away from the dolphin. He sees one people, all descendants of Abraham, each and every one of us under one shepherd, his son. Amen.